Hey everyone, this is our lecture on the Industrial Revolution that I'm going to give you for Tuesday. One of the things about the mid to late 19th century, or the mid to late 19th century and early 20th century, is that we have a number of categories that help push civilization along. And we've already studied kind of the political theme, right, between nationalism, the 1848 revolutions, and the unification of Italy and Germany. But there's an economic theme as well. Now, once we get through the mid 18th and early 20th centuries, then we have to piece them all together. There's going to be a political, there's going to be economic, there's going to be a diplomatic and foreign relations element to this, and we're going to have to look at the whole picture once we're done. So this is going to be the beginning of that economic theme, right? And so it's all going to fit together, and it's all going to be directly linked with each other. And so it's important for us to understand how one affects the other and eventually affects the whole thing, right? So the Industrial Revolution, we've talked about how the West, all the way from the age of exploration, we talked about how the West began to surpass other areas of the world in technology and advancements. We talked about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. We began talking about representative government and nationalism. And during the period of time of the mid-1800s and late 1800s and early 1900s, we have another advance in technology. And that advance in technology is mostly going to be driven by capitalism. It's going to be driven by profit. And it's going to push the economies along and directly affect, as we said, imperialism as well as nationalism. Okay, so let's get started. All right, so this is just kind of an explanation, an introduction to what we're going to talk about, so we can read through it together. The speed of capitalism and the search for profit often outpace the care for the working class. And this is something that we said that we were going to do this lecture on the flipped classroom video and then talk about more the social aspect in class. And this hits at that social aspect. And we see this. This is one of those universal truths that we talk about. When a new invention, a new technology is created, the initial response is to get as much profit, to get as much money as possible, and not really a lot of thought put into the idea of the working class, or are the workers taken care of, and things like that, right? And so we have two waves of the Industrial Revolution. And in this first wave that's going to be in Britain, there's not a lot of thought that's going to go into what about the workers, right? It's just how much productivity can we get out of them in order to get our bottom line and increase our bottom line, right? When we get to the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, which is what we're going to talk about more in class, then there's more of a concern for the working class. How do we keep them happy? How do we keep them productive? Now they're simply just seen as part of the machine, right? And so keep that in mind. The first wave of industrialization occurs in Britain, mostly in textile manufacturing, and so we're going to spend most of this lecture in Britain. Remember that Britain began its rise to power in the Elizabethan age with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. It became the power of the seas. The American Revolution is simply a pause for Britain in that drive to empire, which will eventually become the largest empire in the history of the world, right? And so this whole economic manufacturing is a big part of that push for empire, right? With a global network of trade, British wool, as well as imported fabrics such as cotton and silk, create a more demand that leads to new inventions that increases production, right? And so that's the thing. Since the beginning of the year, we've talked about how civilization is a march from problem to solution. And our problem here is that the world demands goods, such as cloth. And we have to meet those demands, and we have to solve that problem. And we solve that problem through technology, okay? All right, so we begin in Britain with the Enclosure Acts. As most European countries, most countries around the world, the land distribution was skewed. The wealthier classes own most of the land, and the working classes own very little of the land. This goes all the way back to the idea of feudalism. Of course, feudalism in England is gone, but there's a style of feudalism still left. I mean, maybe in America we'd call it sharecropping. No slavery, but sharecropping, right? And this is what we have in England. You have a wealthy landowner, and that wealthy landowner still needs funds to keep up his estate and his grounds. And so what he does is he divides his land among small farmers, and those small farmers rent the land and eventually pay him the rent or the taxes, right? And he uses those funds to help keep his estate going. But during the age of exploration and the global trade, right, it was discovered by the landowners that it was far more profitable to take all of this land that consisted of small farms and widen it out into a large area to make it good for grazing. And there's things and details talking about like a common land, and the law of England had set aside common land for everyone to use. Well, what happened was, of course, the wealthier classes had influence in Parliament, and they got Parliament to pass bills that allowed them to raise the rent on these small farmers and also enclose these public lands, right? And so the farmers couldn't pay their rent, and they also couldn't use the common land anymore because it was closed off by the landlord, and so they eventually were evicted from their property. Now, once evicted from their property, then the large landowner could tear down their houses and spread out that land and create grazing areas instead of farming areas for sheep, for example, that could grow wool. And wool, of course, could be sold not just in England, but along the global trade routes to other places around the world. Okay, now does it sound unfair? Absolutely, but this is the way the world worked in the global market, right? And when we get to our lecture in class, we'll talk about the social effects of this, right? We'll hit on it today and talk more about it in class, okay? So the farmers would be evicted and the land would be enclosed into larger fields. All right, so here's some examples. This is an aerial view of modern day England, but it shows how the large landowners would take the farms and kind of widen them out and put fences around them to keep people out, and those would be grazing areas for sheep. I guess the most heinous examples of this we see in Ireland, because in Ireland the British didn't really consider the Irish equal anyway, because they were essentially a foreign race, which is odd for us to think about. But even though Ireland is so close to England, the British still considered the Irish to be kind of ignorant and low, right? And so what they would do in Ireland is they would raise the rent on houses, and then when the people were evicted, they would tear off the roofs of the houses in order to make sure no one lived there again. And you go in Ireland today and you see all these little cottages with no roofs, and that's when it happened in the 1800s. The landlord would come and evict the tenants and just tear the roof off the house so no one could live there anymore. It's pretty vicious stuff, right? Okay. All right, so new inventions and inventors. We'll get back to the idea of the working class and where these farmers went to later, but let's go ahead and back up and get to the actual inventions. And so there are certain things that are discovered during this period of time that are going to help production and help meet the demand of textiles and other industries, right? First of all, we have coal. Coal is a new source of energy that served as fuel for iron production, right? And fuel for other things as well. And of course, before coal, people would heat things and burn things using wood. But if you live in England, of course, it's an island, and by this time in your history, you have pretty much cut down and burned most of your forests. But then you discover colonies. In America and other places have large forests, and so you have kind of a reprieve from the low amount of wood that you have. But it's still a hassle to take wood and cut it down in America and truck that stuff across the Atlantic to Great Britain. And so coal is discovered at home and becomes a plentiful source of heating. And so wood is replaced by coal, and coal becomes the main fuel source for the new factories, right? Also, new fabrics are discovered in other areas and traded into England. Of course, silk had been coming from Asia for a while, but the new product, of course, that was big in England is cotton. Cotton is cheap and easy to make. And so you could use it, anybody can buy it. It's not silk and only for the wealthier classes. Plantation owners could use it to clothe their slaves, or poor people would use it to clothe themselves. And of course, cotton came from the American colonies, as well as India and even parts of Egypt when the empire gets going, right? And so cotton was coming into the mills, as well as wool, as well as silk that had been there for a while. And so this demand for this new fabric was rising all the time. And so you needed machines. Now, the book talks about a couple of different ways that during the Age of Exploration and after the Age of Exploration, textile manufacturers would try to get enough cloth in order to sell it for a profit. And the book calls it the putting out system. I've also heard it called the cottage industry. And what that really means is women of a village or town would they would be the domestic workers, and they would be in charge of cooking and cleaning, but also making and mending clothes for their husband and their children. And so they were the ones who knew how to sew. So the textile manufacturer would come into these villages and towns and say, and ask the women of the village or town, look, if you produce this much more cloth for me, in addition to what you do for your husband and your children, I'll buy it from you. And it was kind of a home industry or a cottage industry, right? Well, of course, the demand became too great for that to happen, right? And so eventually these machines had to be created to produce enough cloth in order to meet the demand. And so we look at the years here, and we'll look at the names, and this is just kind of a bullet point list, right? John Kay invented the flying shuttle in 1733. This was a sewing machine. We'll look at a picture of it and describe it in a second. Samuel Crompton invented the mule in 1779. Edmund Cartwright the water loom in 1785. And each one of these is a little more productive. It gives a little more cloth. It works a little faster, right? Now, James Watt invented the steam engine in 1765. So we're going back in time a little bit. But what we need to understand about the steam engine is that it would replace water as a source of energy and fuel, right? And so it gets going in 1765, but eventually by 1800, more than 1,000 steam engines were used in Britain. And this is, of course, in the textile industry and in other industries that we'll see. So the steam engine really became the great invention that's going to shift energy from one thing to the other, right? Okay, so John Kay's flying shuttle. Remember, you have to imagine like a lady sitting at home by the fireplace knitting shirts, right? And then we change that and create a flying shuttle. And so what we do is we have yarn, cotton yarn, stretched this way vertically and horizontally. And what the worker would do was pull the rope or push the bar. And as the horizontal and vertical yarn mesh together, they would weave themselves together, right? And you could create cloth coming out this end. And so you have one worker, and he's producing a large amount of cloth, much faster than someone could do it by hand. And so this was a great revolutionary invention to try to speed up textile production. But the next one would do even more. This would be the spinning jenny. As you can see in the spinning jenny, you have spools of thread, and numerous spools of thread. I'm not going to count them, but you can see how many there are. And as the person turns the wheel, these spools of thread will spin and will eventually weave together here and produce cloth coming out this side here. And so this gives you more cloth, more yarn, right? But the issue, of course, is that once you're out of yarn, then you have to replace the spools and, start over. And so you'd get yarn, and then you'd have to stop production. You'd have to load the machine again, and then you have to go again, right? And so that had to be done by hand. But still, it produced more cloth than the flying shuttle did. Then we have Edmund Cartwright's water loom, and of course this was connected to a water source. And many factories during this period of time had to be built close to rivers or streams, like fast-moving streams, so that the wheel outside could spin in the water and thus spin the wheels inside the factory. And so factories were part of that near water sources. And of course the steam engine would change all of that. And so, again, not an engineer, but the belts that you see here would turn the gears inside. Here are the spools, and the spools would run up to the top here, and then the cloth would be woven here and then come down the other side in these spools. And of course, this would still take one or two people to work it, and you would produce large amounts of cloth. Again, you have a problem. We solved that problem with invention. Okay, so James Watt's steam engine. Now, the steam engine was used coal, right? So you burn coal here, it would boil the water, and the water, of course, would produce steam. So you have the steam engine. And so this was the type of engine that could turn wheels and pulleys without any handmade or man-made device, right? Or not human hands. And so you burn the coal, and eventually the things would turn, and that energy, that heat, would create the loom that could run weaving and textile manufacturing machines, right? And then we see this here. Okay. Now, inventions and inventors for steel. Well, we have iron, and we've had iron for a very long time, right? But in this period of time, we go from iron to pure iron to steel, and that process is going to revolutionize a lot of things. It's going to revolutionize the way machines are built. It's going to revolutionize the way buildings are built and architecture. It's going to change the world, essentially, when we go from iron to steel. So refinement of the iron-making process produces a cheaper, stronger product. We have like a new iron called pig iron that's lighter and harder, and it goes through a process. And it's done by burning coke, which is a purified form of coal that smelters. And again, when you melt iron or melt metal, it's smelting. It's not melting. So you're not sniffing anything. It's smelt, right? So the smelters used to build bigger blast furnaces, producing larger amounts of coal, right? And so you have a purified form of coal that produces a high-grade iron that can be used for more building. Then think about it this way. Before this process, most of your bridges, for example, were made out of wood still, even though you had iron and things were made out of iron. The problem with iron is that it would rust, it was too heavy, and so your bridges would mostly still be based on wood, right, or built out of wood. But with the pure iron, you could build more things with it, but we're not there yet, right? Eventually, a scientist named Henry Bessemer would come along, and he would invent a Bessemer converter, which created an alloy, which is iron plus, I think it's aluminum or something that is mixed together, and that would form steel, right? Which is harder and stronger and more resilient. And so this is the best of all worlds. It's cheaper, it's harder, it's more weather resistant, it's flexible, and so now you can use steel to build things with, like build skyscrapers and larger buildings. Now, we're not there yet, but we will be. As steel is produced and more steel is produced, we're going to have things like skyscrapers. We'll have things like suspension bridges with steel cables, and we're able to like span large waterways with these large bridges and stuff. And as we get into the Industrial Revolution, we'll talk more about that idea. But steel is one of those revolutionary inventions that's going to change the world completely, right? And we see its effect today. So from iron to steel. All right, so inventors and inventions, transportation. And so steam and steel combine together to form kind of a new vehicle. And that vehicle is, of course, the horseless carriage or something that can run on tracks without anything pulling it because it's pushed by that steam engine. And the hulk of the machine is made of iron and steel, which could withstand the heat and pressure of that coal engine, right, the steam engine. And so what we're talking about here is, of course, a train, very early trains and locomotives. Now, the first type of locomotives were merely used in coal mines, and they were used to pull coal out of mines and take it to where it needs to go. And so you would have this track running from the mine to, for example, the loading dock, which would use wagons and horses still. But the steam engine, you would pile the coal on the back of it, and the steam engine would just move along those rails to the loading dock and then be loaded onto the wagons to be taken wherever it needed to go. And so that was the first use of the steam engine. And of course, they were slow and they break down a lot. They probably went about 10 to 15 miles an hour, but eventually it would get you there. But you could see the potential here. What if you were to build one big enough to carry people, right? And what if you were to build one fast enough to get you from A to B quicker than a horse could? And so there we are. We've started the steam age, right? So between 1830 and 1870, eventually that was what people were shooting for, and they actually created a steam engine that could carry people. George Stephenson created the rocket. And his claim to fame is that he won a competition against other steam engines that were used to carry people. His steam engine went a blistering 45 kilometers an hour, right? And they called it the rocket because it was so fast. And that was in 1829. And eventually, his steam engine would be used and improved upon and became a major mode of transportation for the people getting from one place to the other. So, between 1830 and 1870, 20,000 kilometers of track were laid in Britain, and 322 million people were carried on steam trains, but also steam ships, which we'll talk about. The idea that this product could also be used on the ocean and rivers as well as on land. So here we have the original. This is Richard Thredovick's steam-powered locomotive. This was mostly used to carry coal from the mines to the loading docks, right, once it was loaded on. And you can see the wheels and turn, and so the engine would be kept in this area right here, and of course the steam would escape this smokestack, which is we're very familiar with on those old coal train engines, and it would just be pushed along with these gears, and it would be pulling carts of coal back here, right? Then we have the rocket, Stephenson's rocket here, right? And you see the engine here, and the steam here, and the person driving the engine as well as the person feeding the engine with coal to keep the fire going, and so it would go, like I said, a blistering 45 miles per hour, kilometers per hour. It would go fast, very fast for people back then, right? Okay. All right, so and then, of course, in America, and we'll talk more about America when we get to the second industrial revolution, but in America, we see a new type of steamship that's created called the paddle boat. Originally, the paddle boat was created by the Fulton brothers. Robert Fulton and his brother created the steamboats originally to carry people to New York City from across the Hudson, right? And so people would get on one side of the Hudson and get on the boat, and it would ferry them across to New York and Manhattan, places like that. And they got a very lucrative business doing that. Eventually, as you're probably familiar with U.S. history, paddle boats would be all over the rivers of the United States. Down the Mississippi, of course, carrying large bales of cotton from slave plantations going all the way down to New Orleans and then across the ocean. Eventually, steamships would be created to go across oceans themselves, and the age of sailing, sadly, was gone, right? Me, the history nerd, loved the sailing ships. But steam caught up with that, and eventually all ships would be steam and none would be sailing. But that would change a lot. It would change a lot of ways that, and for sea and travel and things like that, right? So steam trains, steam ships. All right, so now let's get to the idea of the factory town, right? Let's go back to our farmers who have been evicted from their small farms and so what did they do? They had no life, they had no job, they were out of work, and so many of them would move to cities, what we call urbanization, in order to find work in the new factories. And one of those main areas of work that we see in England is Manchester. Manchester is a major city here with factories, but also tenement housing, which we'll talk about, where it encompassed the lives of all of its workers. And many of these workers, of course, had moved from farms back to cities in order to find work, find a living. Okay, so urbanization. Left without jobs, poor farmers would move to cities looking for work. Some found work in new factories, but the absence of laws to protect the rights of workers meant that the hours were long, conditions were poor, and pay was barely enough to survive. And so we have a period of time in the first wave of the Industrial Revolution where we have no workers' rights, right? No age limit for when a worker could work, no minimum wage, none of that. And so workers are forced to work in factories long hours, dangerous conditions, very little pay, and they have no recourse because if they quit, there's someone waiting to take their job like that, right? There's a huge list of people waiting to take their job. Now, and so the factories would not just include like the father or the mother, but would include the whole family because, again, there are no child labor laws at this point. So children would come and work in the factories along with their mother and father in different places, though, not together, right? And the children would be given kind of menial tasks, but sometimes dangerous tasks, where they'd have to get between the machines and pick cotton out from the machines because they had small fingers and they were small people, and they could do this like dangerous work. And there were no safety pins or gadgets or anything like that because there was no laws to say you had to have them. Okay, so the factory system is what we're talking about here. So technological advances and these large machines had to be put somewhere. So they would create these large warehouses and they would put these machines in rows, like so long rows of machines in this large warehouse. And they would hire the workers from the countryside to come and work each of these machines, right? And so they'd have 2 or 3 or how many workers they needed on each machine, and they would produce cloth all day long. Right, is what they would do. And of course, remember, with the first Industrial Revolution, it's the idea of productivity. How much production can we get from the machine? How much production can we get from the worker? Right, we're not worried about is the worker well fed? Is the worker well clothed? Does the worker have freedom? Is he or she happy? Nobody cares about that. They just want to know how much production they can get out of the worker for the bottom line, right? So workers did not need any specialized skills, but only needed to be taught to work the machine at a certain point. So we're talking about unskilled labor. And with unskilled labor, you don't have to pay them a lot of money because anybody can do it, right? You just teach them how to move this lever up and down, and they do that all day, and you pay them pennies, right? So factories were dark, dangerous places where everything was governed by the clock. And so there's no, like if you're on the farm, and that's one of the things about the world of the Industrial Revolution is that, nobody's going to look at a farmer and say farmers are lazy. Farmers are some of the hardest working people that we know. But you take that farmer who works in a seasonal outdoor capacity with his whole family, right? Planting crops, growing crops. There's a schedule that he keeps, right? And then you take that farmer and his family and put them in a dark, enclosed space, not governed by the sun or the time, but governed by a clock. Then that crushes his passion. It crushes what he does for a living. And so many managers complain about how their workers are lazy and don't need to work. And these farmers are really lazy. But they're not lazy at all. They're just sapped of life, right? They work in this dark place where all they see is a clock, and the clock tells them when to work and when not to work. And so they are essentially part of a machine and not people at all. So we talked about Adam Smith when we talked about the Enlightenment. Adam Smith is the economist, right? He wrote the book, The Wealth of Nations, and he also commented on the idea of early industrialization. Here's what he said in his book. One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head, And the important business of making a pen is, in this matter, divided into about 18 distinct operations. And so there's no longer the craftsman that is the pen maker. You have 18 different people doing one part of that job, and eventually it comes out to a pen, right? Which is what we're talking about, something you stick into a board, yes? And so something as simple as a pen would take 18 steps, and you would just 18 people along the way doing one thing or another, and that is the factory system. Eventually, when we get later on in the industrial age, we'll call it of course I want to say it, I forget what it is, the assembly line. Thank you, Brian. The assembly line, right? Okay, so here are some conditions inside the factory. You can see the rows of machines that we created here in this large warehouse. And so the machine's going to come through here. The women, the ladies are working the machines. Lots of ladies work textile machines, right? Loading the spools, getting out the cloth. And over here we have more machines that women are working. And so this is what they'd be doing all day long in this really cramped space. Loud, you can bet, smelly, I'm sure it was, hot and sweaty, and it was just a very uncomfortable place to work. Here we have a picture of a kid, right, and the kid working in the factory. Many times kids were used, kids smaller than this guy, were used to crawl under the machines and get cotton that had fallen down like fluff. And the machine wouldn't stop. It would be going on over their head, and they would have to crawl under the machine and pick up the fluff and crawl out again. And if, like, you're a little girl who has long hair and you just, like, you raise your head a little too high, it could get caught in the machine and you could be in big trouble. And that happened a lot, you know, so you had to be very careful at what you were doing. So living conditions were, as you can guess, bad. Right? To save money, workers in factories would live in factory housing, which were called tenements. Small apartments would house multiple families with many members sleeping in a single room. And so again, we're just trying to shove as many people as we possibly can in order to find, you know, enough workers to work. Plumbing and sanitation were poor or non-existent, making living conditions very unhealthy. People would get typhus, people would get other types of waterborne diseases because nobody cared about their sanitation. They just kind of sort of, you know, did their own thing, and they didn't have a lot of money either. And so they had to wait and spend their money on food and not, you know, washing things and cleaning things and sanitizing things, right? Those who couldn't find work resulted to illegal activities, making the area dangerous. And that's one thing we haven't talked about. Many people come to these cities looking for work and don't find work. Right? And these are the people on that list that if someone gets fired, they can step in a moment's notice. But what do they do in the meantime? Well, a lot of them chose burglary, thievery, murder, things like that. And so these areas of the city become a place for poor people to live and also a dangerous place to live with high crime rates. So eventually the areas of the cities that were crowded with poor and criminal elements would be called slums. And so that's what we call them. We call them slums. That's where we get the word. And it was because of the working conditions and because everybody was shoved in together in one spot, and that created this type of bad environment for life. So this is a picture of a slum in London or maybe in Manchester. This is an interesting picture. I remember this because this was on my graduate exam to get into graduate school. They showed this picture and they wanted you to like talk about it. And so we see each one of these is an apartment, right? And you can bet the apartment houses probably about 5 families. And so you have these windows here, and you have people in the backyard hanging laundry, and each one is connected by these little walls, so they're shoved together as tightly and packed as possible. Other apartments over here, and then you can see up here is the train, and so you just like smokestacks. You can imagine like the sky is gray all the time, not because it's raining, because it's burning coal constantly, and everything is covered in black soot, and it's just a messy, dirty, grimy life, right? And so not comfortable at all. And again, we don't have any laws yet that are going to change things for these working class and make things better for them, but we will, and that's what we'll talk about in class. Okay, so that's the Industrial Revolution. Just really quick, the idea of the inventions and how the inventions moved civilization along, especially with textiles and then with transportation, and then the working conditions as well. And we'll pick up there with working conditions and move on from there. Okay, so thanks for listening, and I'll see you in class.